Think you're tough, mate? Ancient Rome's toilets had more killers than gladiators. And here's why your weak modern gut wouldn't survive. The world you know, safe, clean, easy. But in ancient Rome, your bowels wouldn't stand a chance. You wouldn't last 5 minutes. Here's why. 90% of people don't know this, but the Romans were shockingly advanced in their day. They built roads, aqueducts, and even had early forms of fast food. But when it came to toilets, well, that's where it gets bloody hell dark. You see, their idea of personal hygiene was, let's say, a bit different from ours. They didn't have toilet paper. Instead, they used sponges on sticks, and those weren't exactly cleaned after each use. And here's the kicker. Public toilets were social hubs. Imagine sitting next to a mate, doing your business while having a chat about the weather or the latest gladiator fight. You'd think that's a bit of a stretch, but in Rome, it was a daily affair. And the disgusting secret they hid was how deadly those communal toilets really were. Diseases spread faster than the gossip around town. Talk about your phone would make you a god. You'd be begging for a modern disinfectant. Now here's a fun one. Roman toilets were often built over running water so the waste would be washed away. Sounds great, right? Well, if you didn't sit correctly or move at the right time, the whole system could backfire and you'd be swimming in, well, let's just say not a pretty sight. Talk about a medieval TikTok challenge from hell. Fair dinkum, it wasn't just about using the loo. In Rome, your chances of surviving a day at the toilet were slimmer than a gladiator's sword. You'd be facing a bacterial battle, mate, and no one had the stomach for it. The disgusting secret they hid was the fact that diseases like dysentery were lurking in every corner, and the worst part, the poor bastards who worked in the sewers and kept things clean were pretty much treated like garbage. You wouldn't last 5 minutes, mate. Not in the stink of those ancient pipes. Let's kick things off with a story that'll make you never look at public toilets the same way again. Picture this. A Roman citizen, let's call him Marcus, heads to the public latrines after a long day of pushing papers and enjoying his wine. He finds a spot on one of those long stone benches and does what any Roman would do. But here's the twist. While Marcus is finishing his business, he accidentally knocks his sponge stick into the water below. In a moment of panic, he reaches down to grab it back, and that's when disaster strikes. The water was far from clean, mate. In fact, it was filled with nasty germs from thousands of other bum wipes. As he pulls the sponge back up, he doesn't know it, but he's already contaminated. Marcus's final days were spent in agony, suffering from an infection that spread faster than you could say bloody hell. His once thriving life ended because he wasn't careful in the one place most people would consider safe. This, mate, was a killer move no one was prepared for. The Roman public toilets were a petri dish for bacteria. It's like trying to survive a medieval TikTok challenge from hell, only it's your intestines that suffer. And with no antibiotics around, it was often game over. The real kicker here is that this wasn't just some isolated case. No. The disgusting secret they hid is that thousands of people likely went out the same way, all thanks to something as simple as a bathroom break. Imagine that. You wouldn't last 5 minutes in that environment. Without modern medicine, even a minor mistake could be your last. All right, let's talk about another bloke, Lucius, who had one of the worst days of his life at the public bath. It all started when he tried to be a bit more daring than usual. Instead of using the standard latrine, Lucius thought it would be better to head down to the sewers themselves. After all, who wouldn't want to see how the Romans managed waste disposal, right? Your phone would make you a god if you had the power to check your maps for something as grim as this. But Lucius was no techie. He thought his curiosity would reward him. As soon as he stepped into the sewer, he was hit by an overwhelming stench. It was a mixture of rotting garum, of fermented fish sauce, and the sweet aroma of, let's just say, it wasn't roses. The deeper he went, the worse it got. The walls of the sewer were lined with waste, and the path was slippery with filth. Fair dinkum horrible, mate. But Lucius, undeterred, pushed on, determined to see what was at the heart of the Roman waste system. Here's where things went from bad to worse. In his attempt to get a closer look, Lucius slipped, tumbling straight into the muck. No joke. He didn't just fall. He was completely submerged in everything that had been flushed away for years. Bacteria swarmed around him, and within a few days, Lucius was dead. It wasn't the fall that killed him. but the bacteria and diseases that thrived in those filthy waters. This was the sort of environment where survival was far from a guarantee. The disgusting secret they hid in the Roman sewers, 1,000 hidden dangers in every puddle of waste. To think of it, Lucius's tale was a regular occurrence. They didn't know about antibiotics, and hygiene was just a distant dream. You wouldn't last 5 minutes in these conditions, mate. No chance. Now, let me tell you about a bloke named Tiberius, who made the fatal mistake of overindulging in garum. Garum, if you didn't know, is a fermented fish sauce that the Romans bloody loved. It was the ketchup of the ancient world. They put it on everything. Now you reckon you've had some bad food experiences, mate, but the disgusting secret they hid about garum? Well, you're in for a treat. Tiberius thought he could handle a feast, so he doused his food in garum, thinking it would spice things up. After all, the Romans used the stuff like it was going out of fashion. Little did he know, the garum he ate wasn't as fresh as he thought. It had been sitting around in the hot sun for far too long. Imagine leaving a steak out in 40-degree heat for a few days and thinking it's still fine. Well, that's pretty much what he was dealing with. You wouldn't last 5 minutes after a meal like that. Tiberius, being the hearty eater he was, went straight to bed after dinner. But the next morning, his stomach was in knots and his skin was starting to turn pale. The food poisoning from the rotten garum took him out faster than a gladiator's sword. Within hours, he was dead, his insides basically liquefied by the ancient Roman version of fast food gone wrong. To think, mate, this bloke's final moments were spent clutching his gut, wondering if he could have survived with a bit of modern hygiene. The Romans didn't have fridges, and they certainly didn't know what best before meant. Fair dinkum horrible, eh? No chance you'd survive. That in their time. Now let's talk about the public baths. These were a massive part of Roman life, right? Every citizen, from the lowliest peasant to the richest senator, would go for a good soak to relax after a hard day. The idea of washing away the grime of daily life sounds great, doesn't it? But in Roman times, those baths weren't just about cleaning up. They were a breeding ground for some of the nastiest diseases you can imagine. There was a chap called Gaius who visited the baths religiously. After all, it was the place to be, socializing, chatting about politics, and even meeting potential mates. One day, Gaius was enjoying his soak when he noticed something odd. The water wasn't as clear as usual, but, never one to complain, he shrugged it off and carried on with his conversation, thinking it was just the usual filth of the masses. Your phone would make you a god in that situation, wouldn't it, mate? You'd be calling for a ride home. But Gaius didn't have that luxury. As it turns out, that odd water wasn't just cloudy, it was contaminated. You see, the Romans used urine for all sorts of things, from whitening their teeth to cleaning their clothes. Yeah, they thought. It was a miracle substance, but they didn't realize that urine, especially when left to sit in the public baths, could breed infections and parasites. Gaius had unknowingly soaked in a bath full of bacteria and toxins, and by the end of the day, he felt a bit off. Just a little dizzy, a bit of a stomachache. No big deal, right? Well, a few days later, Gaius started showing symptoms of something far worse. His skin began to break out in sores and his stomach turned into a battlefield. He had caught a parasite from the public bath that slowly ate away at his insides. The nasty truth is that public baths were often full of infections. And Gaius? He didn't make it. He died a slow, painful death from the very place he thought he'd be cleaning up in. The disgusting secret they hid? The water in those baths was a hotbed of diseases, and one dip could cost you your life. You think you'd survive a day there, mate? You wouldn't last 5 minutes in those infected waters. Not a chance. Now let me take you to a rather fancy dinner party hosted by a wealthy Roman named Aulus. This bloke had all the fine things. Exquisite. Food, imported wine, and the finest guests in Rome. But what Aulus didn't realize was that his lavish spread was about to turn into a nightmare for everyone at the table. You see, Aulus had ordered a rare delicacy for the evening, a dish called dormice. Yes, mate, you heard me right. They used to eat stuffed mice, cooked in honey and poppy seeds. It was considered a luxurious treat, and Aulus was showing off a bit. Imagine serving a stuffed mouse at your next dinner party. Bloody hell, you'd be the talk of the town, eh? But this wasn't just any mouse. No, this particular batch had been poorly preserved. The dormice had been stored in improper conditions, causing them to become contaminated with toxins. Now, it wasn't obvious at first. The guests were happily munching away, enjoying the wine and the entertainment. But within hours of the feast, the first signs of trouble began. One by one, Aulus's guests started feeling queasy, with sharp stomach pains and nausea. They figured it was just indigestion at first, but soon it became clear it was much worse. What Aulus didn't know was that the toxins in the dormice were actually botulinum, the very same poison that can cause botulism. And just like that, his guests started dropping like flies. No modern medicine, no way of stopping it. By the end of the night, most of the partygoers had been taken out by the very food they thought was a delicacy. The disgusting secret they hid? If you didn't cook things just right, or store them properly, you could be signing your death warrant with every bite. In ancient Rome, food poisoning wasn't just a mild inconvenience. It could be your last meal, and there was no way to tell what would be safe. Fair dinkum horrible, mate. I reckon you wouldn't last 5 minutes at a dinner party like that, not without a good dose of modern-day antibiotics. Let's switch it up a bit, mate. Imagine you've just been invited to a grand feast in the heart of Rome. You're excited, walking through the bustling streets, the sense of roasting meats and freshly baked bread in the air. The Roman roads are renowned for being the best in the world, smooth, paved, and perfect for travel. But what you don't know is that these roads might as well be a death trap in disguise. The Romans, clever as they were, didn't always get the little details right. These roads, while impressive, were full of hidden dangers. If you were traveling long distances, you'd have to deal with the risks of getting sick on the way. You wouldn't think much of it until you realize the roadways were filled with exposed sewage, animal waste, and human filth. The Romans didn't have modern drains, mate. All that waste was left to fester by the side of the road, making travel a literal dangerous walk of death. One such bloke, Decimus, decided to take a trip to see his family. He set off down one of these fancy Roman roads, hoping to get there quickly and avoid the mess. Your phone would make you a god in this situation, no doubt. You could track your journey, keep your distance from the muck, and maybe even call an Uber. But Decimus wasn't so lucky. As he walked along, his foot slipped on some old rancid waste, and he fell face first into the muck. Pretty gross, eh? But it wasn't the fall that did him in. It was the bacteria that had festered in the waste he'd just landed in. The disgusting secret they hid was that those roads were full of disease-ridden filth, and getting a good dose of it was just part of the Roman travel experience. Decimus didn't have time to get to a healer before his stomach started churning. The next thing he knew, his insides were racked with agony, and he was dead within a few days. The problem? He caught dysentery, which spread like wildfire in those filthy streets. You wouldn't last 5 minutes walking those Roman roads. Not a chance, mate. Now let's talk about wine. The Romans loved their wine. Drank it like it was water, in fact. You might even think, well, I could totally survive that. Just keep my cup full and I'm good to go. But hold up, mate. You wouldn't last 5 minutes if you took a gulp from the wrong bottle in ancient Rome. You see, the Romans didn't exactly have a grasp on modern winemaking. Oh, sure, they had their fancy vineyards and made wine in every possible variety, but their methods, well, let's just say they were a bit off. In fact, Roman wine often had some questionable ingredients. For starters, they'd add things like lead to sweeten the wine. Yes, mate, you heard that right. Lead. It was thought to enhance the taste and preserve the wine. But the real kicker? The disgusting secret they hid was that lead poisoning was rampant. Drink enough of it, and you'd be dead before you even realized. Let's say you're at a grand banquet as a well-to-do Roman citizen. You've got your wine glass in hand, chatting about the latest gossip. The wine is sweet, refreshing, and you've had a few too many cups. But those cups? They were often lined with lead, and with every sip you're drinking a slow poison. A little bit of lead won't do much in the short term, but over time, it builds up in your body, causing severe organ damage, confusion, and, eventually, death. That's exactly what happened to a bloke named Tiberius, who, after decades of indulging in rich, sweet wine, found himself suffering from mental fog and aches. At first, he thought it was just old age, but it was the lead-in, the wine that did him in. His family didn't realize it at the time, but Tiberius was a victim of a slow, deadly process. Eventually, he slipped into madness and died from organ failure. If you were living in Rome, you'd be rolling the dice every time you took a drink. Fair dinkum horrible, mate. Wine was both a gift and a curse. One sip and your fate could be sealed. Well, mate, if you've made it this far, I reckon you're probably wondering just how you would have survived back in the Roman days. Spoiler alert, you wouldn't last 5 minutes. Every step, every meal, every sip of wine could have been the end of you. From deadly toilets to poisoned wine and the filth-ridden streets, the Romans didn't make it easy for anyone to stay alive. But don't worry, if you managed to stick around this long, you've survived the worst of it. Or maybe just a little of it. The truth is, if you'd been there, you'd have been lucky to make it out of a public toilet alive, let alone the streets or dinner parties. Modern life really isn't so bad, eh? If you survived this story, subscribe, mate. Tomorrow, we reveal why pirates hated gold and you'll laugh at what they preferred. Click now and sleep like a drunk Viking. Remember, life today is far more comfortable than what those ancient Romans had to deal with. So next time you're complaining about your modern comforts, just remember, at least you're not sitting on a sponge stick with a sewer full of disease beneath you. Fair dinkum. Let's shift gears for a moment, mate, and take a look at the gladiators. We all know the tales of brave warriors fighting in the Colosseum, right? But what you don't hear much about is the real fate of these men. Sure, they were tough as nails and fought like bloody lions, but the life of a gladiator wasn't as glamorous as you might think. You might imagine their deaths to be quick, honorable. But mate, it was much worse than that. Take the story of Quintus, a gladiator who fought in the famous games. On the outside, he looked like the picture of strength, muscles, fierce looks, and a reputation that made the crowd go wild. But behind the scenes, his life was more about surviving the unbearable conditions than actual glory. You wouldn't believe it, but gladiators were often forced to train in filthy, overcrowded camps. The food they ate was basic at best, and their wounds were rarely treated properly. After a particularly brutal match, Quintus was left with a serious gash in his side. Instead of getting proper medical attention, he was tossed into a filthy pit with a bunch of other injured gladiators, left to fend for himself. The disgusting secret they hid about these fighters? The majority of them died not from the arena, but from infection, dehydration, or sheer neglect. Their wounds would fester because there was no time to heal, and they didn't have modern medicine to stop the infections from taking over. Quintus's story didn't end with his big fight. No, his final moments were spent in agony as the infection spread through his body, poisoning him slowly. You wouldn't last 5 minutes in that environment, mate, not unless you had the strength of a bull and the luck of a Roman emperor. But even then, the odds were stacked against you. Let's talk about the forgotten people of Rome for a second, those who lived in the slums. You've heard the stories of the mighty emperors and the grand feasts, but the reality for the average Roman citizen was far more grim. The poorest of the poor lived in crowded, unsanitary conditions where every single day was a fight for survival. And mate, you wouldn't last 5 minutes in their shoes. Take a man named Aemilius, who lived in one of the overcrowded insulae, Roman apartment blocks where space was tight and disease was rife. These buildings were often so poorly constructed that the walls were damp, the floors were filthy, and the air was thick with the stench of human waste. But it wasn't just the living conditions that made these places deadly. No, the real issue was the constant threat of disease. Without proper sanitation, disease spread like wildfire, and Aemilius was about to find out how unforgiving Roman life could be for the poor. One day, a strange sickness began to spread through Aemilius's insula. At first, it was just a few coughs and fevers, but within days, more and more people started falling ill, collapsing in the streets. People didn't know what was happening, but we know now it was likely the plague, brought on by the filth and overcrowding. The disgusting secret they hid in these slums was that without the luxury of a bath or clean water, poor Romans were constantly at risk of dying from something as simple as a cough. Aemilius didn't survive the plague. He died in his sleep, his body succumbing to the infection that he couldn't avoid. This wasn't an uncommon fate for those at the bottom of Roman society. Fair dinkum, mate, the diseases that tore through. Those insula didn't care who you were. Your social standing didn't mean a thing when you were fighting to breathe through infected air. You wouldn't last 5 minutes in those conditions. The poor had no escape. All right, mate, let's talk about the Roman army. These were some of the toughest blokes around, right? Marching across the empire, fighting battles, and conquering lands. They were the backbone of Roman power. But here's a little secret. Those soldiers didn't get all the glory and luxury you might expect. In fact, they were often living on the edge of starvation, with food that would turn your stomach inside out. Let's take the story of Titus, a Roman legionary who spent years on the front lines in Britain. The Roman army had to supply itself with food that could withstand long campaigns, and the rations they got weren't exactly top-notch. The soldiers' diet mainly consisted of grain, dried meat, and garum, that fermented fish sauce I mentioned earlier. Sounds like a decent meal, right? Well, the truth was their food often came spoiled or infested with maggots. Imagine biting into your ration and finding a fat, wriggling maggot in the middle of your bread. Fair dinkum, mate, it was a whole new level of gross. Titus was out in the field, trying to make do with what he had. One day, while trying to prepare his rations, he noticed that the grain was crawling with insects. But he was a soldier, and a soldier eats what he's given. So he did what any good Roman would do. He ate it anyway. Within hours, Titus was feeling sick. He'd already contracted a nasty infection from the spoiled food, and by the end of the week, his condition had worsened. He couldn't even walk anymore, let alone fight. The camp physician tried everything, but the infection had taken hold. Titus died from food poisoning, a victim of the army's poor rations and lack of proper food storage. The worst part? This wasn't just a one-off. You wouldn't last 5 minutes if you were in the army relying on those rations. The food was often more of a death sentence than a meal, and the soldiers who survived the battles sometimes didn't make it past the next meal. The disgusting secret they hid? Even the might of the Roman army couldn't escape the dangers of bad food. All right, mate, I reckon we've covered a lot of nasty bits of Roman life, but there's one last thing we need to talk about: the public baths. You might have thought earlier that the public baths were a place to relax and unwind, but in reality, they were a bloody death trap. In fact, if you had any sense of hygiene, you wouldn't dare set foot in one of these Roman death traps. Trust me, you wouldn't last 5 minutes. Let's take a bloke called Publius. Publius, much like any other Roman, loved a good bath. So, one day, after a hard day of work, he decided to hit up the public baths to clean up and mingle with the locals. Little did he know, he was walking straight into a hotbed of disease. The Romans used oils and scrapers to clean themselves, but these tools weren't exactly well maintained. Most were shared by hundreds of people, passing the oils and grime from person to person. And the water? It wasn't exactly as clean as it looked. The public bathhouses were often heated using coal or wood, and this constant exposure to high temperatures was a perfect breeding ground for bacteria. But even worse, the Romans used to dip in the same water over and over again. The disgusting secret they hid? If you got in the bath with a wound or infection, you were pretty much guaranteed to spread it to everyone else. Publius didn't think twice as he dipped into the water, hoping for some relaxation. By the end of the day, his skin was red and irritated. Within a week, his body was covered in boils. That bath? It gave him a nasty case of what we would now call flesh-eating bacteria. Publius's death wasn't pretty. The bacteria quickly spread through his body, and despite the Roman attempts at treatment, it was too late. His body deteriorated so quickly that it was barely recognized by the time he passed. Fair dinkum, mate. That was the fate of far too many Romans who thought a bath was the key to a relaxing day. So, remember this next time you're complaining about modern hygiene. You're lucky we've got hot showers, proper disinfectants, and even basic antibiotics. You wouldn't last 5 minutes back then. Well, mate, you've made it to the end of a rather gruesome journey through the bloody mess that was ancient Rome. From deadly toilets to spoiled rations, from plague-infested slums to public baths full of disease, life back then was no walk in the park. You really reckon you'd survive in that world? You'd be lucky to make it a day, let alone a week. You wouldn't last 5 minutes, that's for sure. But now with modern technology, hygiene, and medicine, we've come a long way, eh? No more relying on questionable sponges, no more eating spoiled food, and no more garum, thank goodness. The good news, mate, is that you've got the luxury of comfort and safety that the Romans could only dream of. So next time you're whinging about a bad day, remember how easy you've got it. Now, if you've survived this bloody tale, subscribe, mate. Tomorrow we'll reveal why pirates hated gold. And trust me, you'll laugh at what they really preferred. Click now and sleep like a drunk Viking. Just remember, next time you're sitting on your comfortable toilet or enjoying a nice clean shower, think back to the poor bastards in ancient Rome. They didn't have it nearly as good as you do. Fair. Dinkum, mate, you've got it easy. Thanks for sticking around and sweet dreams. Let's hope they're not full of Roman rats and infected water.